Good afternoon. Yes, good evening, good afternoon to everybody, or good morning if you're on my side of the hemisphere of the earth. Welcome to yet another webinar from the Resilience Engineering Association. This is the fourth in this ongoing series. These webinars have been an important forum for discussion on current topics on resilience engineering and complex systems, as we practitioners strive to push the theory deeper and explore ways to widen its application in real-world domains. So with that, I will pass it on to my colleague Maria to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Sadip. Well, I'm very excited to present our speakers today, Teemu Reiman. Teemu is not only a world-leading expert in safety culture and leadership, but is also a great example of how research and practice can be brought together. Teemu is CEO of Lilikoi, where he works with very complex organizations like nuclear or railways, and is also an associate professor at Aalto University in Finland. He's very committed to sharing knowledge through conferences, papers, books, and today's webinar actually is based on his last book, which is Safety in Complex Organization and Cultural Perspective. So I don't want to take more of your time, Teemu. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. I think I'm already sharing my slides, so can somebody from the audience acknowledge that you are seeing my presentation?
We can see the slides. We just need it's not in presentation mode yet.
Yes, but someone showed that. Okay, they are seeing. Very good. So I'll go to the presentation mode, and now it's on. Good. So thank you for the opportunity to speak here today about safety in complex organizations, a cultural perspective on how safety and accidents emerge. So, well, Maria already told a bit of my background, so not much to add there. As she said, I'm kind of always been trying to be between two worlds, or one foot in research and one foot in practice, and I've been working at both as a senior, both as a researcher and then also as safety culture program manager at the nuclear new build company, and nowadays I'm working as independent consultant, still doing research, but also quite a lot of different types of assessments, trainings, and development projects. And I recently wrote a book on safety in complex organizations, where I tried to summarize the lessons that I've learned during my career on what does safety look like if we look at it from a cultural approach. How do organizations look like if we look at them from a cultural approach? And today I'm not going to present the book. I'm not going to kind of give you an outline of the book, but I will focus on kind of a couple of key issues, mainly from the very beginning of the book, from the introduction chapter, and then from the chapter 12. It's kind of summarizes the I would say the change in thinking that we need if we want to manage safety, in complex organizations, and especially taking into account the social complexity and how they are in fact cultures. So I will first talk about a little bit about the current challenges we have in understanding and managing safety, then very briefly about organizational culture, and then I will present my kind of four main views on how we should rethink safety if we look at it from a cultural lens. And I will present some practical advice on what it means to manage safety from a cultural perspective, and then brief conclusions. So current challenge is in understanding and managing safety. Why do we need a culture approach? Don't we already have safety culture, and don't we already have safety management, resilience engineering, and all these things? What is this culture approach? Is there anything new in that? Well, first of all, we have a lot of challenges. Well, we keep seeing similar accidents, but I would say that we still struggle to understand that how they happen in reality. We have seen that nowadays we've expanded the root cause to so-called safety culture. So it's kind of become almost fashionable to say that the challenge was a lack of safety culture or a deficient, inadequate safety culture. But I wonder if that actually explains what happened. Do we really understand what happened if we say that yes, it was because they didn't have safety culture or the safety culture was inadequate? And if it doesn't actually help to explain what happened, then the next question is, do we really understand what is the role of culture in organizations, and what is the role of culture in safety? And I think we need to rethink this a little bit in order for us to really understand better what are we talking about. The second challenge that I've observed both from research and practice is that we keep adding interventions, we keep adding safety management systems, documents, rules, instructions, programs, but we really don't always understand how safety actually changes, for better or for worse. The assumption seems to be that, well, if we kind of cumulatively add barriers or add interventions, add programs, surely the safety must be better. But for me, it raises the question that what are we actually managing, and do we actually understand what it means to so-called manage safety? Because can safety actually be managed? It seems very often that these attempts to intervene and these programs kind of treat safety as its own separate thing, something that we can somehow kind of extract from all the other things that the organization are doing and then manage safety by itself. And nowadays we are doing the same thing with culture. We try to manage culture as a thing in itself. And that's a challenge. We miss a lot, and I think we don't get very far if we try to manage both safety and manage culture, independent of the work that we are doing, independent of the system, independent of culture, really culture. And how this show, I've seen that even though we talk about more and more things like, well, safety culture, human and organizational factors, all these different new safety paradigms, we actually still very often, especially in practice, but I've seen also this in research, we still continue to basically ask the same questions. We look for better solutions, but we don't necessarily revisit our questions. So we still keep asking, why people keep breaking the rules? How should we prevent human errors? How to identify and remove unsafe acts, and so on? What is the level of our safety culture? It's a kind of a clear continuum of this asking very simplified questions on topics that are actually systemic and complex. How to measure safety, preferably with one number. This is something that I encountered so many times when I was a practitioner, that people wanted simple measurements of safety, simple measurements of safety culture, one number at most. So then we should just get a better solution for how to more efficiently measure something that actually cannot be measured. How can we lower our incident rates and so on and so on. So we keep asking the same questions. And then we look for better, more efficient solutions into what, in my view, are actually not very culturally sensitive questions. So do we really try to understand our organizations, or are we actually trying to simplify the organizations so that we can actually better attribute blame for failure? So what is underlying these very simplistic, control-oriented questions? Is it that we are guarding our back? We are thinking that, okay, if something happens, at least it's much easier to find who made the error. So again, what are our assumptions behind these questions? And do we regularly revisit the basis of why we think these questions are important? And I think we don't do that often enough. And very importantly, and especially since I'm talking about cultural approach, and you can challenge me and say that well, we've been talking about safety culture since the Chernobyl, with just Chernobyl disaster just turned 40 last 2 weeks ago. So safety culture has been around for decades. So we talk about culture, yes, but my premise is, and my argument is, that even though we talk about culture, we actually rarely think culturally about safety. And safety culture as a concept, as the way it has developed, it is not very cultural in the way that when researchers who specialize in culture or even managers who really understand the importance of culture, importance of leadership, and so on. Safety culture is not, in its current formulation, not very much like that. It's more close to kind of being a behavior, looking at how even individuals behave. It is managerialist, meaning that it's used as a method of control. Actually, it's used as a method of power to kind of to get the management agenda to the shop floor, and it's normative. It's something that kind of presupposes that there is the one best way to do work. So these approaches, they miss a lot of things that actually are the most important in the field, like sense making, power and trade-offs, norms, social structure that is already there, present in the system, and the everyday production and reproduction of culture. So the current safety culture approach is, I think, safety culture as a concept has a lot of promise, but at the moment, it is not very cultural. But this also means that there's been a lot of critique of safety culture over the years, and from many approaches, also from the resilience engineering. But as I see it, it very often targets the current formulation of the safety culture concept, which I argue is, or I agree, it's not very cultural. But I don't see it as a critique of culture. It's more of a critique of behaviorist, managerialist, and overly normative approach to safety. And yes, I agree. We should move further. We should move away from overly behaviorist, overly managerialist, overly normative approach to safety. But my answer is that actually we should move towards a cultural approach where we actually understand in more detail the social system, the things that people actually deal with. Challenge number 5, the final challenge. It is actually a little bit similar to how we talk about culture without really talking about culture. We tend to argue about safety management. We tend to argue what works and what doesn't work. And if you like to look at LinkedIn, there's a lot of arguments that behavior-based safety can it be used or cannot be used, or what works and what not. But we actually don't very often define again the premises. What are the questions that we are asking? What is the safety we are talking about? And in my book, I present these 3 different ways of talking about safety, or defining safety as the absence of errors and deviations. Of course, you will see a lot of Holnagel's safety 1 and safety 2 there. Safety as the ability to succeed under varying conditions. But I also propose this kind of a balancing approach of safety as hazard control that is actually in a way going to the origins of safety management and the engineering and technical based safety management, where we start from the hazards, we start from what is actually threatening our system. And I'm not arguing that one of them is better than the other. It depends a lot on what kind of hazards are we dealing with. And I'm arguing that however you define safety, however you see the hazards, it's a cultural phenomenon. It has a lot of influence on how the organization then starts to interpret the risks, how they will then go on doing their work and approaching all the safety barriers and safety management in general. And some of the things that also are missed a little bit when we argue about safety management and what works and what doesn't work without going into this hazard-based approach is that I argue that different hazards require very different logics of control in the organization. So I differentiate, for example, between local hazards and so-called core task related hazards. And these core task related hazards are things that relate to, for example, process control. They can have a quite wide ranging and system-wide consequences, and they typically are things that need a little bit of a centralized control. They also need safety departments who are doing much more kind of a long-term analysis and looking at the system and standardizing much more so than for so-called local hazards, which are those that are typically associated with occupational safety issues, where we can actually only when we've seen the workplace, when we've seen how things have been assembled, who's there to work this day, and how can we put the scaffolding in place and so on. These local hazards, they require much more adaptation, much more of this kind of a situational judgment than core task hazards. So what they do require is a different culture. So again, from a cultural approach, it's very interesting to look at how organizations approach safety and how they approach the hazards behind the safety. Why they need to be safe? From what they need to be safe, and how does it show in when they are how they are then actually trying to organize their activities. But this is something that in my view, we very often miss. And I saw also this when I was working at the nuclear industry, that before we clearly clarified and defined that what is the safety we are talking about and what are the hazards behind those, nuclear safety and occupational safety people were kind of talking past each other. We made assumptions based on our culture that if I say safety, of course I mean nuclear safety. If they made assumptions that if they say safety, of course they mean occupational safety. Of course they mean people falling from heights and so on. So we argue about safety management, what works and what doesn't, but we much less argue about what is actually threatening the system, what are the hazards, and how the different hazards actually require different forms of control from the organization, how they require actually different culture from the organization. So a culture approach asks, what assumptions about safety are embedded in our system? How do we how do we see safety at the moment? So these were the assumptions. I'm not going very deeply into the kind of the idea of what organizational culture is, but as I said, I basically use much of the book in trying to clarify what culture is. But that's just to kind of summarize. It is a learned, first of all, it's learned, and it's a learned system of meaning. But very important, the culture is something that simplifies complexity. And it simplifies complexity so that we are able to act, so that we don't have to every time think that, okay, so how am I going to interact in this case? This person is speaking, saying this and this to me. How should I react? Is he being hostile? Is he proposing something? Or we have a lot of kind of ready-made solutions thanks to culture, thanks to this shared learning of how things are typically done. So it's very much grounded in practice, and it's actually born when we work and when we interact together. But it is embedded in structures, it's embedded in routines. So once we kind of form culture, we also store it in the structures, the tools we have, the organizational structures. They all kind of maintain and promote a certain way of working, a certain way of thinking about these issues. They highlight some issues, some risks as important, and then at the same time, they downplay some issues. But what is good culture and what is not good culture? It's contextual. And as I said, it's shaped by the work the organization is doing, the hazards. So another challenge with these overly normative models is that they propose one single, one size fits all approach, and then they will just come and say that, okay, now this is how your culture should look like. But that is seldom the case when you go into an organization that has spent many, many years working together, learning to work together, learning to do the work. You just cannot say immediately what's the best approach for them. But of course, culture is also seldom unified. There are always subcultures, and that is one of the interesting things empirically to also find out why these subcultures exist and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that they exist. Very often it's a good thing that everybody doesn't think alike. So culture shows in what we do, and it especially shows in what we don't do. And it always both enables and constrains. Sometimes when we talk about safety culture, we kind of assume that it's the kind of the cure for all ills. There is no culture that would just enable. Every culture constrains, and it's just a matter of what things are downplayed, what things are highlighted, whether they are the right things. If yes, then the culture supports safety. If no, then the culture may actually hinder safety. And culture adapts, culture changes, but it's a different type of adaptation than what we very often talk when we are talking about resilient adaptation. It's based on many kind of forces and many motives, and kind of task completion is only one of them. So cultures may also adapt into a direction that in the long term they are not anymore so functional. So that's one of the reasons that even though I'm critical of the safety culture concept, I actually do safety culture assessments. I call them safety culture assessment, but what I do in reality is I look at the organizational culture, and one of the things I look is exactly this adaptation. Where is the culture slowly developing? What are the forces kind of driving culture there, and is it going in a direction that is good for safety, or is it going in the direction that that may bring in some risks in future? In my book, I have 2 models of culture. I don't have time to go to these, but these are basically probably the more familiar model of culture as an iceberg, as a structure. And then I propose also kind of an idea of seeing culture in a more process way, kind of more like an underlying current, where the practices and structures are kind of in a constant circle of sense making. What is important for us? How should we interpret what happened? How should we go on doing and work, and so on and so on. So it's much more kind of a dynamic model. But I'm not arguing that we should forget the structural model, because it also highlights very important things about how cultures develop these assumptions, cultures develop these deep ideas about this is the right way to do. These are the hazards that are most critical for us, and these are the norms that we should adhere to. And then very often these are very difficult to change, and they really become part of the structure. So culture should be really seen as both the structure and the process. And these 2 different ways of seeing highlight different things about culture as a phenomenon, and different things actually about organization as a phenomenon. Because if you look at the theories of organizational culture, and even Edgar Scheins, who's obviously kind of the inventor of this three-level model, in his thinking, and I agree, only the basic assumptions are actually culture. Everything else here is climate, and this is something that shows up. The kind of tip of the iceberg is something that we see in an organization. We see some indicators, we see some outcomes, events, but they're not really culture. Even behavior is not culture. We need to go deeper. We need to understand that, okay, so what motivates this behavior? What kind of assumptions are they making? Why are they acting on this? Why are they not focusing on this issue, even though in our view it's very critical to safety? What kind of assumptions are they making about safety, and so on? So these really highlight different, but both very important aspects of what it means to manage safety in organizations. And if we take culture seriously, as I propose in my book, that it's really time to start taking culture seriously in safety management, then many of the kind of the traditional assumptions in conventional safety management start to shift. We need to approach organizations a little bit differently. We need to really think about how we understand organizations, because as I said, the models of culture really are also models of what is an organization. So organizations are not kind of mechanistic structures, but there is ongoing organizing. There is collective sense making of what is important, what is not important. The structures, even though they are called structures, they're never static. They're constantly changing based on what we see as important, what we see as not important. And most of all, especially when we bring in the ideas from complexity, science, and systems research, we see that organizations, they are not inherently stable. So the dynamics that we have in organizations, we sometimes kind of think that organizations, once they're set up, we have the rules, we have the procedures, we have the organization structure, then it's just, a clear way ahead until something happens, and then we change again. But they're not actually, it's not very natural for them to actually even be safe, I would argue, because there's a lot of things going on. It's always a dynamic process just to keep them stable, which is what Carl Wake actually said it already in 1987, but we still don't, in my view, take it enough seriously in terms of what it means to really keep the culture alive and culture such that it highlights risks. But then, in addition to understanding organizations, if we look at culture and take culture seriously and look at how leadership and influence happens in organizations, we actually see that that many of the most important leadership and most important ways of influencing are actually indirect. We try to have direct control. We very often and wish that we could control everything that happens in organizations. But once we understand that organizations are not inherently stable, it's ongoing organizing, collective sense making, we have to realize that leadership can never be about controlling. Leadership can never be about direct influence only. Sometimes we need to intervene, sometimes we need this, but that's can't be the only way. It needs to move more to this kind of indirect way where we are shaping conditions, we are enabling the behavior of others, we are influencing indirectly, we are also with our examples as leaders, we are creating the culture, we are creating the kind of the decision premises that, okay, this is the way to act in certain circumstances. The challenge here is that in a way, it feels more comfortable when we are in direct control. All of us, or not all of us, but it's a very human feeling. We want to feel in control. But in a way, we need to be able to let go of the excessive attempts to control and also trust that once we shape the conditions, people will do their best to keep us safe. And also sometimes leadership doesn't take place from outside the system, especially in safety culture and change initiatives. I see that people kind of think that okay, I'm changing how the others act, I'm changing how the others think, and the leaders don't consider that maybe I need to change also. Was that a 5-minute mark? Okay, it does. Okay, I'll speed things up. Good, thanks. So, third one, what are we managing? I really talked about this already, that safety and culture are not really objects of direct control or measurement. So we need to move forward from trying to really, even though we talk about safety management, we are managing the organization, we are shaping the conditions in which safety can emerge. And the same goes for safety culture. We have safety culture programs and a kind of development projects directly focusing on that. But we sometimes need those. Sometimes it's good to kind of remind people about safety issues, but we are not really managing culture. We are not really managing safety. We are managing the organization and making sure that they take care of the hazards. And finally, how we understand change. As I already mentioned here, change is continuous, adaptive, and emergent development. And it's not simply something that is initiated and implemented by the management. So we really need to understand how social systems continuously change, the practices change, the structures change, the assumptions, the underlying logics change. And the best we can do as managers, leaders, we can try to steer that change into the direction that it better contributes to safety. So what it means for managing safety culturally. First of all, acknowledge that the world is both real and socially constructed. There's a scientific discussion, social constructivism versus positivism, which positivism goes too much into the real aspect, and sometimes social constructivism goes too much into this. Everything is socially constructed. I think they're both. We have harm, hazards that can cause physical harm, but still organizations are composed of people who interpret situations. They make, in a way, their own world. They construct the world. But sometimes that world can actually cause them harm, because if they miss something, if they misinterpret things. So these are not in contradiction. We can see both worlds as kind of a real and socially constructed. And one of the things is acknowledge the power, meanings, assumptions, beliefs. People really act on what they see as real, right, relevant. And the structures we have in organization, they reinforce these interpretations. So again, not only is the culture approach about looking at people and how people think, it's also very much about looking at our structures, even the technology. How does this reinforce certain interpretation? How much this guides our way of working, the organizational structures, different tools, and so on. And tensions in organizations, complex social systems, they are in a constant flux. So we need to really kind of acknowledge that that these systems are not stable until something outside happens, but we need to be active in keeping them stable. And be reflective as leaders, safety professionals, even researchers. The language, assumptions, and accents, they always influence culture, whether people intend it or not. So it's very important to ask always, what are we missing? What are we oversimplifying? What we are actually making more complex than necessary. So these are the kind of foundations and practical implications. First of all, it's very important to acknowledge the indirect influence. The way safety professionals, I would add leaders here also, how they frame different problems. I started with that, are we actually asking the right questions? What kind of questions they ask, how they conduct investigations. That's much more influential than some safety culture program or slogans. But also, they also shape culture by what they measure. There's a lot of talk about indicators, and recently there's been this safety theater idea and safety clutter and so on. It needs to be acknowledged that the way things that we measure, the things we put there into the system, they have an indirect influence on people, and it's not always to the better. It may lead to shortcuts. It may lead to people reporting something that they think the management wants to see. And these are all indirect influences that shape the culture. Understand work before judging outcomes. Of course, in resilience, we talk about understanding the normal work, understanding also the deviations, but I also always emphasize that understand the effort, understand the kind of the mental effort and the meaning that the work has for the people. Not only the work as a kind of a workflow or adaptations that happen, but how they make sense, and how they think, how the work means, what the risks, what the hazards mean to people. And going back to change reason, we have to change the conditions, not the people, and also look at the processes, effort, and gradients in addition to outcomes. So the system can produce a good outcome, but if the gradient is in the wrong direction, or if the effort is kind of extensive, then it will not be very safe for a long time. We need to be mindful of how we use assessments, indicators, and reviews that we should be using them to kind of reveal tensions, surface questions, not only just to check compliance, and actually kind of broaden the attention and try to kind of with our actions bring in more things for people to notice, rather than kind of narrow and focus on only one or couple of the things. And yes, be aware of the unintended consequences. Numerical indicators and targets. This has been now discussed in safety science a lot. That numerical indicators, targets. Sometimes we need them, but these are really a challenge. I could actually leave with that. I'll just check if there is anything I really want to say about the cultural approach. I see it more as a lens for understanding how safety is enacted in organizations. It's not a simple one method. I propose a lot of, or I go through a lot of different safety management tools in my book, but more from the perspective of how to use this tool from a cultural perspective. Not that here is a cultural tool or here is the tool to really make the change. We don't need new tools. We need to use the old tools in a way that actually produces results, and use the old tools so that we are mindful of the unintended consequences and the effects that we may have. So we don't implement or control safety. We create it every day to how we collectively make sense of work, make decisions, and respond to uncertainty. And culture matters because it shapes what organizations notice, value, normalize, and ignore, and how they make sense of their work and hazards. And that's why I think that the cultural approach to organizations, it's a very needed lens that we have been missing because we have been focusing on arguing partly about the wrong issues in the past. That's it, and some of the references that I didn't have place to put into the presentation. Thank you. Sorry for going a couple of minutes over.
Thank you, Teemu. Yeah.
Can we proceed to the Q&A? Thank you, Teemu. We have 5 questions in the Q&A. The first question from Angelo Cianfrocco is, what types of technologies can play a role in helping to improve and measure safety culture?
Well, I would start from saying that you cannot measure safety culture. When I assess culture for safety, I use different methods. So I always do interviews. I do use survey also because it's a good way to reach everybody. I do focus groups. I want to talk to people in groups because then I see the kind of the group dynamics and how people really work on issues together. I always also try to read some of their documents, safety management related documents, and then if possible observe the work that they are doing. That's unfortunately very often that is the one thing that I'm not able to do in projects, but it's a combination of kind of information from these different aspects of how they see the world work, what kind of things they emphasize, how they interact together, what kind of issues they raise. But it's not a measurement. It's trying to surface the way they think and trying to surface things that they may be missing, and then bring it back to them, and then again discuss with them that how they see my view of the culture as an outsider, and then kind of work on that towards what should be improved, what is actually working already fine. So it's an iterative process, and it's really very often people at some point, especially the senior managers, ask for a number that, okay, now that we did the assessment, so are we 2.5 or 3 or something like that? And always try to emphasize that it's completely meaningless for me to give you a number. I can do it if I must, but it doesn't tell you anything. So too often we go for a kind of quantitative approach when we actually need qualitative understanding. So that would be my answer.
A second question is, safety culture is usually looked at as a layer in top of the business lens. How can looking at safety through an operational lens change the framing so it's more integrated instead of just a buzzword, as it's seen a lot of the time?
Yes, that's also a good question. I think one thing also that we really need to think on which occasions we even should use the term safety culture. In my view, the best use is for experts in the safety organization when they are trying to kind of understand the organization and understand the kind of the trade-offs, the pressures in the field. So for them to really get a deep understanding of what is safety culture, and when they make their analysis, I think that's the best use for the term safety culture. But when I go to talk with the line personnel or the line managers, I typically don't talk about safety culture because it is a buzzword easily, and it then it kind of clouds the fact that they do have a culture. They do have a culture that affects how they see safety, that it affects how they see leadership and so on. So we very easily go on the wrong track when we talk about explicitly about safety culture. So I would still use it, but I would really be careful about when to talk about safety culture, so that it doesn't become a separate phenomena from the normal work. So that we would first talk about the work things, and then we remind people that, hey, safety culture is important too. That's what I see very often, and that's a sure way to really alienate the concept from the real work. So, but it's really tricky. It's good that safety culture as a concept kind of reminds us that that culture can affect safety, and culture should support safety. But then the other side is that once we kind of think that it's its own phenomena, it's something that exists independently of how we do work, then we are on the wrong track, then it can actually be harmful for safety.
Another question is there really a need to engage with culture as an idea within safety practices, even though it may be a valid construct to better understand organizations? Or can better progress be made just by focusing efforts on creating safer workplaces and supporting systems?
From my perspective, they're the same thing. These two. What I see is that the culture approach just provides kind of the frame of how to think about how to create these safer workplaces. So I don't see any contradiction there. In fact, I would argue that the only way to succeed in creating these safer workplaces is to kind of build more on the culture approach.
Another question is, how do we reconcile the approaches to control hazards that are rooted in reliability and system safety with the social safety movements? Is it wrong then for organizations in industries with real hazards, such as mining, to be skilled towards the engineering approach rather the social safety movement?
There was some disturbance. There's some noise.
That's a very long
I didn't-
question.
Is it in that? Maybe I can read it because I think it was
In the Q&A.
here. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is very good. As I showed in the slide with the three approaches, I put the hazard control in the center. That it's kind of a thing that keeps everything balanced, or everything actually in. For me, it is the key. It is where things should start, from hazard control. So I am not saying that they should really go only, for example, to kind of this interpretive social idea of safety, but I'm just saying that you need different ways of looking at it. And again, it depends on the industry, which one of them is, I would say, the most important one. So I very often kind of try to remind people that we seem to have forgotten the hazard control, because we talk about safety one as like trying to prevent errors, and then we go into safety two as some kind of facilitating success. But I think we tend to forget the most important thing, and that's that we have hazards that can actually cause significant harm, and we need to control them. So it is actually something we need to balance, these two approaches. So it's very important. So yeah, thank you for the question.
And that's all the questions. Anthony, you're moved.
Anthony is moved.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Teemu. Fascinating presentation, very stimulating, very challenging for many, I'm sure, as they grapple with their view of what safety culture is or is not. One of the things in the book is the role of groups and the role of individuals. I just wondered how you saw the role of individuals in organizations, or even within the small groups that become so important in terms of cultural perspective.
So yeah, so the role of individuals, yeah, I think it's also, yeah, it's very interesting, and one of the things that I didn't have time to discuss is the issue of power, and the role of individual is basically, in my view, it comes from the power and the possibility of influence, and actually it goes into the idea also of leadership, which we often think that leaders are these people high on the hierarchy, but that actually leaders exist anywhere in the system. They are the people, anybody who shapes meanings, anybody who kind of creates constraints and possibilities for others in a way is a leader. And the more power you have to shape meanings in an organization, the more you also have an influence on culture. So that's why, of course, when some people like Edgar Schein talks about a lot about how the senior the management creates culture, and sometimes I'm been a bit against it because it sounds too much kind of an individual focused approach. But on the other hand, the senior managers, they have so much power that the decisions that they make, they have a significant influence on how the culture will shape in, if not tomorrow, but in the years to come. So in that sense, the role of the individual is kind of deeply related to the sources of power in an organization.
We have another question, but first, will this presentation be shared? Yes, we'll share the presentation on the Resilience Engineering Association LinkedIn by this weekend. So you can check the recording there. And another question for Teemu is, how difficult is it to avoid the traps in latching onto safety culture as a simple idea, and instead utilize the approaches you have outlined by James Cole?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's difficult for my customers, but it's difficult for me also. And one of the reasons is that I see it also when I've been doing even when I've been doing kind of accident or incident investigations, because we are so narrative people. We like narratives, and we like we like simplicity. And so many times I kind of when doing incident investigation, hearing one person's story, I was, oh wow, okay, so that's what happened, and I'm kind of convinced. And then I go to speak to the next person who has a completely different story, and I thought, wow, okay, so that's what happened. The other one was wrong. Then I go to a third person, and I, wow, okay, so that's what happened. The other two were wrong. So the kind of we need to always resist the temptation to simplify and the temptation to just create a good story, because that's so deeply ingrained in us that we do it very, very easily. And the safety culture is a simple idea as a root cause. It's a nice story, and it's very tempting to use it. And I've understood that also some organizations like it as a root cause because it really doesn't say anything. So it's a kind of a safe root cause. So it's a story that everybody loves, but it's the wrong story, and that's the problem.
Okay, thank you very much. As you said, we will be recording this, and recording will appear in the REA LinkedIn website some point in the next couple of days. So we've come to the end of this, our last webinar of the 25-26 series. Thanks to everyone for joining. We will be resuming these after the summer break. The date for the first webinar is scheduled for the 29th of September. And you may know there is a book celebrating 20 years of resilient engineering. It's set to be published this autumn. We will be hosting a series of webinars that build on the publication of the book. The first webinar in September will consider the outlook from meeting the Porto that actually celebrated the 20th year anniversary. And that then led to a further book, which is published this year. We'll be inviting people who wrote those chapters to present specific chapters. So the second webinar in October will be the authors or the editors of the book, Ari Adjunson, Gila Pretorius, and Kari Pachinko. So please look out for our upcoming webinars. Look out for our announcements in the series. Until then, we wish you, for all the team here, a wonderful summer. And thank you very much, Teemu, for giving us such an illuminating and stimulating presentation.
Thank you.